Hello, all, and now we are going to round up the empirical thinkers and turn to David Hume now and his skepticism of causal inference and how we can know empirical knowledge out of it. And it's kind of interesting to see how, in a very short period of time of only 5 or 6 decades, you find John Locke's rational um, optimism, I suppose you would call it, towards his theory of ideas become abandoned here by Hume for admittedly his own moral psychology and ethics that he builds out of it, but it's often discarded and not really talked about very much. Hume is known more for his skepticism and abandoning the sort of empirical, what do we know is real sort of way Locke was going about his own project of trying to have rational images towards building a kind of consensus of taking that kind of cold step back and having this approach of trying to look at things in that sort of taming of the passions. Hume says that the passions is what the philosophy of life really is all about, that he directs us to early on in his work. Also, it's kind of an aside here, but his inquiry is more posh towards, if you were just trying to get a quick read on what he is famous for in his ideas, but his treatise is the more scholarly edition if you were interested in David Hume. But so I guess to really see through to his skepticism of causal inference, he's going to look towards a kind of ethical subjectiveness of moral feelings that guide us, not these abstract sort of ethics, and not of course out of natural law, but of the subjectiveness of our moral feelings of sharing the similarities of what it's like to feel pain. And there's kind of a distinct rebuilding and hashing of that sort of Hellenic thought of hedonism, of pleasure and pain kind of being the ethical standpoint, certainly in that Hobbesian tradition as well. But this really leads to his main I suppose contribution and term that is used the most common in Hume language is impressions, obviously out of the passions, out of this forceful and vivacious event that we seem to have these sort of experiences with, that we can kind of build a sort of psychology of belief out of. And these impressions is his kind of counteraction to Locke's clear and distinct ideas. It's these passions and these provocations that come about. It's not the contents of the reasoning, it's the physical stimulation. If I raise my voice really loud, you're going to notice that I raise my voice. It's not really so much about the contents, it's the pain and the shock instead of the abstraction. And so this is really kind of harking towards his ethics, his look at physical stimulation and the causal effective way we can look about ethics and its emotions. That's how Whitehead's going to look at it later. This is kind of bridging that together, but it's kind of interesting to look over his looking towards the self as a kind of ethical standpoint and its relation to others. And so you can see perhaps how this plays into the tradition of American legalism, and obviously all of the famous legal cases and going on right now or concluding with Rittenhouse and others, where you have these kind of impressions of danger, and now you have these judgments out of it. And I think you can kind of hark back towards American law being and stand your ground out of even here with the kind of impressions of what is considered a dangerous life and threatening situation. And so he's really looking to undermine the kind of cognitive rationale of the conscious state towards a more physical perception, the sort of appearances, the phenomenological, as it's going to become more prevalent later in videos. The appearances is what Hume really wants to push us towards understanding. And this certainly goes hand with his ideas of memory. And so we build these sort of resemblances out of these physical stimulation. You can remember something that was repugnant to you, and this forms a kind of mental habit. So we can examine these sort of mental habits that eventually form a sort of custom, a sort of shared way of looking at memories, but ultimately they are ingrained with the self. They are experienced with the self. We can't know it empirically is really what Hume is trying to get at, and why he's so famous for his skepticism and abandoning of the project. But nonetheless, I still think that he's often forgotten for his psychology and what he tries to build in spite of that, even though you could argue that it's not the most eloquent of philosophical systems and ethics to refer to. But I do think that there is something to be said really about overall the characteristics of the kind of eccentric Anglo thinker, and perhaps it's even a testament to that in that their philosophy isn't perhaps considered the highest marks compared to the Continentals and stuff like that. Certainly my favorites, of course, I've made no mistake about that. But I think, if you look at some of the literature and history, the Blakes and people like that, then I think you actually see rich philosophical concepts within that sort of literature. And I think that kind of goes back towards what Roger Scruton would talk about with these sort of eccentric Englishmen and how they built their society around that. It's very admirable in my mind. But anyway, I wanted to now kind of talk about how Hume considers this sort of spatial and temporal way of explaining particular ideas. And so, like, we have this sort of habit forming towards chronological order of history and, aligning particular ideas. He's makes no mistake of his kind of nominal tradition that he follows with Berkeley in a lot of ways. And there's strains of his kind of mentalist aspects as well, despite his skepticism. So to him, the natural is this kind of empirical generalization, but we may not know causality. We can't actually know it on an empirical basis, but we have this sort of hearkening towards grappling with causality. And so this kind of goes to how he would explain miracles. Miracles is something totally unrelated to the consensus that we formed out of our impressions and its memory of it. the miracle is, what offsets what the impressions and customs that we had formed before. So it's kind of impossible to fathom in that sort of sense. There really is a kind of almost, eternal return in a way here, where you kind of go back through these sort of impressions, even though we can't know them abstractly. We still have these impressions that, these passions that push us, even though we can't know it in a causal manner. Although he does talk about things like probability, and while probability he doesn't necessarily mean a sort of mathematical understanding or axiom of it, it's more proportioning and kind of an assurance of what you could believe in. And so I think that could kind of lead into what he has to say about identity, and it's kind of interesting to see identity in this sort of context in the 18th and 17th century thinkers here, as compared to identity today. There is a lot of differences, I think, going on here. Hume thinks of ideas more as a kind of theater of ideas arising into your life as these passions that you have to contend with, that you don't really understand the causal process of it, but nonetheless they are happening around you. And so the self has to grapple with these ideas that come about, and they come and go, and you can't really control when that temporally happens, but nonetheless you have this sort of deterministic outlook in a way that Hume comes about with. You can't really just have identity just relegated to superficial characteristics. There's ideas about going on that, again, you can't really empirically know on a rational basis, of course, is what Hume would say, but it is a sort of theater going on, as opposed to trying to, I suppose, align yourself with these sort of qualities that I think is very, very very relevant for mechanistic thinking of the self, I think, that we see in contemporary times and times since then. But nonetheless, though, he wants to build out of the self that there is a sort of uniformity to these kinds of things. And so he has a kind of occasionalist view. There is no habitual experience of causal power, but questions of meaning or ideas of meaning that go beyond this sort of rational, empirical way of looking at it. And that's what Hume is trying to build out of his project. But I think I wanted to just kind of touch base with some of his basic ideas of the impression and see how his passions is trying to build towards his ethical system. And I think I'll make another video about his ethical system before we move on to Kant, because it's very important, I think, to get Hume down if we're going to do Kant right. I think no one would argue with that. So it's important to get these kind of things down and touch base on them as best as we can if we want to do work on these other thinkers as well. But yeah, I think that's going to end here, and we'll move on to the next part. But thanks for watching.